Thank you to those who have joined us this evening. My name is Laurel, and I am a grad Global Impact intern at International House. The mission of International House is to enable students and scholars from around the world to live and learn together in a diverse community that builds lifelong qualities of leadership, respect, and friendship. Founded in 1932 by John D. Rockefeller Jr., International House of Chicago is today one of 20 members of the International House's worldwide network. In addition to supporting the graduate student community through our Graduate Commons program, International House also serves the greater Chicago community as a cultural and intellectual center for a wide array of programs. Close to 100 public programs are held each year at International House through the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series. And as we begin the autumn quarter, we'll be providing in virtual, in-person, and hybrid programming. You can learn more about the different types of events at ihouse.uchicago.edu. The Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series includes outreach programs with Chicago area international organizations, collaborations with foreign consulates, music and cultural performances, and discussions and debates led by distinguished guest speakers, including those for today's program that we are so pleased to co-sponsor with Seminary Co-op Bookstores. In Tax the Rich, co-authors Erica Payne and Morris Pearl take readers on an engaging and enlightening insider's tour of the nation's tax code, explaining exactly how the rich and the politicians they control manipulate the US tax code to ensure the rich get richer and everyone else is left holding the bag. Blunt and irreverent, Tax the Rich unapologetically dismantles the intellectual justifications for a tax code that virtually guarantees de-establishing levels of inequality and consequent social unrest. Erica Payne is founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires, a group of hundreds of high net worth Americans committed to making all Americans better off by building a more prosperous, stable, and inclusive nation, and ensuring that millionaires, billionaires, and corporations pay their fair share of taxes. She is also the author of The Practical Progressive and lives in Washington, D.C. Morris Pearl, a former managing director of BlackRock, is now chair of the Patriotic Millionaires. He lives in New York City. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, so please submit those via the Q&A function. And don't forget that you can purchase Tax the Rich from Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Now, please welcome Erica Payne and Morris Pearl.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. So I thought we would start off tonight with a little explanation of what the Patriotic Millionaires are. So Morris is a member and I'm the founder of the organization. And I thought we'd give a little background about that, tell you about the work that we do, and then climb into some of the topics in the book, and then bring us up to current day. And we'll answer the crazy question, why are we in Morgantown, West Virginia on a random Tuesday night? So just to start, the Patriotic Millionaires first came together in 2010 during the lame duck session of Congress, when it became clear that President Obama was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts. And that just really frustrated me. Here was a Democratic president working with Republicans to lower the tax rates on some of the richest people in the country. And it just made me really mad. So I called some millionaires I know, and they got together and wrote a pretty short but very pointed letter that just said, for the good of the country, raise our taxes. And I guess the message was so strange coming from a group of millionaires that it really blew up in the media. And before you knew it, every television station in the country was covering it. It actually went international. The president of the Czech Republic talked about the Patriotic Millionaires on the floor of the Czech Parliament. The largest television station in Japan came to Washington to follow us around when we were doing some lobbying. And so that was now coming up on 11 years ago. And we worked together for a couple of years. And then eventually President Obama did end the extension of the Bush tax cuts. There was a compromise. And so with that small victory in hand, we turned our attention to look at what is the biggest problem in the country that a group of millionaires could help solve. And the decision that we made was that really the existential threat to the country is inequality. Inequality is at 100-year highs, and it's getting worse every day, and it's getting worse more quickly every day. So that's the primary problem we try to solve. The three areas of work that the organization does: we work on tax policy, primarily trying to make sure that millionaires, billionaires, and corporations pay their fair share in taxes. But we also do work in two other core areas that are essential to our country and frankly, every country's political economy, which is basically the intersection of economic decisions made in the political arena. And so we work on tax policy, and the other two pieces are a livable minimum wage. A federal wage for right now is $7.25 an hour, $2.13 for tipped workers, certainly not enough to survive on. So we'd like to see that raised to $15 an hour and have one fair wage with tips on top for folks who work in as waiters, and bartenders, and that kind of thing. And then the third piece is political equality, which is really what pulls the whole thing together. We're in the spot that we're in now, becoming more and more unequal with each passing day, because a few people with a whole lot of money and a whole lot of political power are manipulating the tax code and with it the economy to make sure that basically all of the benefits flow to them and people like them. So that's a little pause about the group. And now I think I'll just kick it to my co-author, Morris. Morris, why don't you talk to folks about why you personally decided to join the group?
Sure, thank you. My name is Morris Pearl. I spent most of my career on Wall Street, building big computer systems to find arbitrages in the market for asset-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, things like that. And I tried retiring and joined academia back in 2003 after we sold Payne, where I was working at the time, to UBS. I actually found out that academia is much more competitive than bond trading. And I can be the 100th best bond trader in the city and be very, very rich. I can be the 100th best professor in the department where I was at Columbia University in the city of New York. There's unemployed people who are well above that. So I fortunately, I was lucky that it only took me about 6 months to figure that out. And I decided to join BlackRock. So I was a managing director there in the financial markets group. And most of my clients that we were dealing with in my department were governments. We were hired by the Fed to figure out how much the bank bailouts of Citibank and the like were costing the taxpayers, doing similar projects for the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, the Hellenic Republic. And one day I was doing a due diligence meeting on the top floor penthouse dining room at the headquarters of a big bank in Athens, Greece. And I picked up some dessert and I walked over to the window so people wouldn't see I was taking 2 chocolate puddings from the buffet. And I thought I saw a parade on the street for a minute. And then I realized it wasn't a parade, it was a riot, kind of moving down the street. And I finished my chocolate pudding in the dining room. And I turned back around and walked back to the couple of dozen bankers. And I kind of thought to myself, I mean, are we really doing any good for the rest of the people of Greece outside of these couple of dozen people whose jobs we were hoping to save by getting a bailout for their bank from the IMF? A few months later, I left BlackRock, decided I've done as much as I could for the shareholders of that company. And I decided to spend my time full-time working, doing advocacy work, politics, policy work with Erica, with the Patriotic Millionaires, basically because I thought that was the best way I could improve the lives of my children and their generation. And that changing the government policies that were producing some of the outcomes that I didn't like would be far more valuable to my children and their generation, and now I have a grandchild too, than making an extra few $1 million for them. So that's what we're trying to do. Rather than take all of our money and use it to do something very direct, we are trying to leverage that money by hiring a staff of wonderful people working under Erica's direction that are actually going to Washington, getting our members to go into the halls of Congress, either virtually by Zoom or physically by walking in the door, and explain to these lawmakers that we, actual rich people, actual investors, actual business people, do not want to live in a country with a few rich people and lots of poor people. It doesn't work. They tried that in South Africa when I was a teenager. It did not end well for the rich people. So that's what I'm trying to do. And that's what we're trying to do in our book. We basically try to explain how some of the problems are caused because the rich are getting richer and richer and richer, and everyone else who is working for a living is just getting by because we, people like me who don't actually work for a living, don't pay income taxes the way you guys who get paychecks with money deducted from those checks every single week do. So I'm getting further and further and further ahead. And it's just not right. It's producing a system which is going to end up with a few very rich people, which is fine for the very rich people, but not really, because we can only get rich. We can only make money. We can only invest and build businesses if we live in a nation with millions and millions and millions of people who pay their bills every month, who buy expensive groceries, who buy expensive ice cream and expensive shoes, and do all of the other things that help entrepreneurs get rich. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to preserve this nation, and we're trying to change policies to do it. And our book, Tax the Rich, basically explains why it is that our system has rich people paying far lower tax rates than people who work for a living.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll tell you, one of my favorite things that Morris says is he always says, he says, listen, I'm not any more altruistic than the next guy. I'm just greedy for a different kind of country. And so he wants to live in a country, as most of us do, with more fairness for, you know, our families and us to live in. And that's not the country that we have now. And it's not the country in large part because of the tax code. So just to give you some historical perspective, after World War II, the highest marginal income tax rate was 91%. It is now today 37%. When Ronald and Nancy Reagan went into the White House, the estate tax exemption was the equivalent of around $650,000 today. And on anything above that, you paid 70% of that inherited income in taxes. Today, the estate tax exemption is $11 million for an individual and $22 million for a couple. And the top rate on estates is 40%. So here's the thing, we're moving into, and we've already moved, I mean, we're at 100-year level highs of inequality. And just to give you a sense of the human cost of inequality, right now in America, 2.5 million people are addicted to opioids. Deaths of despair, deaths due to alcohol, suicide, and drugs are higher than they have ever been recorded. Life expectancy is actually going down for segments of our population. And this is something that has been brought about basically because of policy choices that lawmakers made under the profound influence of their campaign donors. And there's no better place to look. If you ever wonder, does money have an outsized influence in the American political system? Just look at the tax code and you'll say it absolutely does. But the problem with tax code and the problem with taxes is that it's boring, or people think it's boring. Morris and I don't think it's boring at all. We think taxes are the most amazing thing ever to talk about and think about, but it's not a subject that, you know, immediately lights people up. So what we wanted to do in our book, Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer, is we wanted to break it down to make it easy for people. I certainly, growing up as a kid in North Carolina, had no idea that I was going to grow up and work on tax policy. But after I got these folks to work on this letter and put this letter out 11 years ago, I really started to climb into tax policy. And the more I learned about tax policy, the more ridiculous the whole thing became to me. That I knew that people can't, you know, people are working two jobs. They're not able to figure out what is the carried interest loophole, what is the 1031 exchange, what are all of these things that basically make sure that rich people get richer and richer and everybody else is left holding the bag. And so what we do in the book is we compare two couples, the Workharts and the Slumps. The work hearts are regular folks. They go to work every day. They earn ordinary income. Work, you go to a job, you get a paycheck, you come home from that job. That is one kind of income, ordinary income. Another kind of income is investment income. And that's what Morris makes. So Morris doesn't work anymore unless you count the work that he does with me, which we don't pay him for. And so Morris, if we're comparing a wealthy person, an investor, to a working person, we do this in the book. So if two couples both make $100,000, one couple by working, by going, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, they make $100,000. At the end of the year, their tax bill is about $9,000. So Morris, if you go on your E-Trade account right now and sell stock worth $100,000, what will your tax bill be on that $100,000 at the end of the year?
Well, nothing. That's not earned income at all. It's investment income. Investors like me who make long-term capital gains, we pay taxes instead of the rates of 10% up to 30 something percent that people like Erica, who works for a living, pays. We pay tax rates of 0% for the first bunch, 15 and 20%. So I wouldn't pay any taxes at all if I only made $100,000.
Yeah, and so if you think about that, here's one person who's already very wealthy and another person who's working to get their family secure, but the working person ends the year $9,000 poorer than the investor. And it goes on from there. If it's $50,000, it's about $3,000 the working people are poorer than the wealthy person at the end of the year. If it's 200, the numbers go up from there. So that's just one of the pieces. I think of that as the original sin in the tax code. And so President Biden, to kind of bring it to modern day, President Biden has suggested that the tax rates for any incomes over $1 million, regardless of how you make it, whether you make it from ordinary income or from capital gains, that tax rate should be equaled across those dollars above $1 million. But then we have Democrats in Congress who have rejected Biden's idea. And so a bill that just came out of the House suggested that capital gains should pay a little bit higher than they're paying right now, but they've kept that preferential treatment for the rich. And so Morris, one of the excuses that they use for keeping this preferential treatment for the wealthy in the tax code is they say the wealthy are job creators. So are you a job creator, Morris?
I think I helped create your job, Erica. But other than that, no. I invest money in the stock market. That's true. I make lots of money investing in the stock market. But I didn't create anybody's job. For instance, like take Apple, for example. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars of stock invested in Apple. But I didn't send any money to Apple to make that investment. I bought those shares of stock from other investors who happened to be selling them that day. So they were transferred from one investor to another investor, me. And now they've gone up in value, by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I've on paper made lots of money. But not only have I created no jobs at all, I haven't paid any tax on that money I made either, because I never sold the stock. And I still own hundreds of thousands, well, now even more, because it's gone up a lot. But I've never paid any tax at all on any money that I've made on what we call unrealized capital gains. That's when you invest money, you make a lot of money. You can even take some of the money out of your brokerage account and spend it if you want to, because I have a margin account. But I never actually sell any stock, so I never actually have any income. Because we here in the United States, we don't tax people for making money. We don't tax people for getting rich. We tax people for having what we call taxable income. And taxable income mostly means income from a job. It could mean income from selling something, but it mostly means income from jobs. And if you're very rich, you don't need to have any income. You're already rich.
And one of the other things that that we've learned is that as people have these unrealized capital gains, so take a Jeff Bezos. He owns this company, and so his stock goes through the roof. He never has to sell any stock. What he does instead is he borrows against the asset that he owns, so he can go throughout his entire life and never pay any income taxes or pay very little. Now, the second piece that we talk about in the book is wealth and how wealth is taxed. So Morris, let's say that you own a little $250,000 house in Morganton, West Virginia, which is where we are right now. What would you pay in taxes on that little $250,000 house?
$2,000 or $3,000 a year, is that right?
$2,000 or $3,000 a year. That's exactly right. And because that's most American families keep their money in their house. If you have wealth, maybe you have a little in your retirement account, but you basically keep it in the house. Now, say that Morris also owns a $250,000 house in Morganton, West Virginia, but with all the rest of his money, he bought a racehorse and a bunch of stock and some paintings and a yacht, and then a little baby yacht to keep the big yacht company. And what else did he buy? He bought an antique pot of gold coins. So Morris, say that you had your house in Morganton, West Virginia, and your pot of gold coins, your racehorses, your Picasso paintings, and all of that other stuff was worth $500 million. So your total wealth is $500,250,000. How much taxes would you pay compared to the couple that only has that house in Morganton, West Virginia? What's the difference in your tax bill?
Well, it'd be nothing, because I pay the same real estate taxes they would, because we only charge wealth tax on real estate like houses. We don't charge a wealth tax on things that rich people own, like mostly stocks and bonds and investments and stuff like that. But it could be racehorses or whatever else you happen to have. Because when the country was founded by the founding fathers, they created commonwealths because they knew we needed commonwealth. And they taxed people based on their wealth, which was their land. That was basically all the wealth there was in the country when the country was founded, was land. And so taxes were based on taxing land. That meant rich people paid lots of taxes. Poor people who didn't own any land didn't pay much taxes at all. But now we have a system where rich people mostly don't own land. They own stocks and bonds and businesses and all kinds of stuff. And regular middle-class people own houses that they live in. And so regular middle-class people are paying a wealth tax every single year when they get their real estate tax bills. And rich people like me, I pay virtually no wealth tax. I live in a fancy apartment in New York, which I own, and part of my monthly fee for the apartment thing goes to pay real estate tax in the apartment building. But that's a minuscule part of my wealth in terms of where I am. So I pay virtually no tax that's based on my wealth either.
So now, Morris, let's dive into some of the absolutely ridiculous loopholes that are inside the tax code. So one of our loopholes that we talk about in the book is called the 1031 exchange. Morris just mentioned, was talking about real estate. So Morris, why don't you tell everybody about the 1031 exchange?
Sure. And you guys who are listening can put in questions too, by the way, if you want to. We'll continue making up our own questions if you want, but we'll answer whatever questions anyone has. And we like argumentative questions too, so don't worry about it. But meanwhile, back to the 1031 exchange. Yeah, I have no idea why we need a 1031 exchange, but the basic idea is that normally for most investments, if you buy an investment, when it goes up in value and you sell it, the difference in value, the amount it went up, assuming it went up, that's profit. And you pay tax on that profit. That profit does count as income. The amount that your investment made up between the time you bought it and the time you sold it. Except, there's an exception. For section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code has what's called like-kind exchanges. If you have a real estate and you have your real estate goes up in value, and then you sell it, but you take all or most of the money and buy some other real estate, and it could be 6 months later, 6 months earlier, or some other time. If you eventually buy some other real estate, it doesn't count. So the 1031 exchange means that as in real estate investors buy small amounts of real estate, and then as it goes up by bigger and bigger and bigger amounts of real estate, they never pay any income tax on the amount that their holdings increase by. Unlike stock market investors who do pay income tax if they sell stock. You know, if you go into Robinhood or E-Trade or anything, you buy some stock, it goes up in value, sell it, that counts as taxable income. Whether or not you buy more stock the next day or the next month or any other time, it wouldn't make any difference. You still have taxable income. But for real estate investors, they don't count that as taxable income if they buy some other real estate investment within the next few months.
And
And
Morris, what's the
we also
result of
invest with
that
them.
over time? Like what happens if a real estate investor just keeps on selling and buying more property? What's the result of that? Like why should we care?
Well, the result of that is that some people, these wealthy real estate development families in, you know, New York, Chicago, wherever, become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. But all the rest of the people who don't buy and sell real estate all the time, they're left holding the bag because they're the ones who pay taxes every single year. And any of you guys at the University of Chicago who study this stuff would know that if you make money from salary and a certain amount is deducted from that every single year, and you can invest what's left, you'll make far, far less money, and you'll fall farther and farther behind people who make investments and don't have to pay any taxes, you know, on that investment income until they die, and maybe not even then, because their heirs may not pay any tax either.
And then speaking of heirs, and we have a question that I want to jump to, but I want to make sure we connect this loophole with one other that's very ridiculous. There's another loophole that's called the stepped up basis. And so how that works is if Morris buys a stock for $1 million and holds it for several years until it gets to be worth $10 million, and then he sells it, the basis of what he bought it for is $1 million. He sells it for $10 million. So he has $9 million worth of gains. If he sells that whole portfolio of stock in 1 year and makes that $9 million, he will pay taxes on that $9 million. But say that the day before Morris went to sell that stock, he dies and he leaves all of that stock to his heirs. Well, his heirs inherit that stock at the new basis of $10 million. And so if they sold it on that day, they would not pay any taxes. That $9 million of gains is completely wiped out for tax purposes. And so when these two loopholes work together, the stepped up basis with the 1031 exchange, you can find multimillionaire real estate families who just essentially create a dynasty over time of what's in essence typically tax-free money. All right, so we have a question in the chat. It says, who is your target audience? Lower and middle class families being harmed by the current tax code, or other rich people you hope might care about the injustice? And I'll take a little bit of this one. So both of those folks are our audience. So we're right now in Morganton, West Virginia, and we started the day. We headed to West Virginia because we want to talk to working class folks in West Virginia. Right now, there's a bill in Congress called the I guess nickname or technical term for it is the reconciliation bill for how it has to get passed. But it's essentially about $3.5 trillion that President Biden would like to see spent on American families. He thinks the federal government should pay for everything from dentures and hearing aids for the elderly to free pre-K for working families and a lot of stuff in between. This is what people in Washington are calling the human infrastructure bill. How can we build an architecture to help support American families, get folks back to work and make their lives work a little better? It has free community college, things like that. So anyway, he wants to spend $3.5 trillion. Joe Manchin, who's the senator from West Virginia, wants to spend $1.5 trillion. He thinks spending more than that is fiscal insanity. Morris and I think that it's fiscal insanity to have working people pay higher taxes, pay a higher tax rate than millionaires. And so we are in West Virginia for the next 3 days trying to talk to some of the working folks in this great, beautiful state that is also very poor, because Joe Manchin holds in his hands right now the keys to our future. He can either decide to correct the absurd and immoral and economically ridiculous tax code or not. And so we want to talk to some of his voters to help encourage him. He has said that he wants to do tax reform first before he decides how much money and what programs they want to put into place. And so we're saying, great, Senator Manchin, we'll take you at your word. So we want to talk to his folks who vote for him and these working folks who I don't think have any idea that they are paying a higher tax rate than millionaires like Morris. And then the other half is we also have other rich people that we think should care about this injustice. So Morris, what do you think about your class of folks? Should they be concerned about this? And why are we talking to them too?
Well, I do think they should be concerned about this. I think that most people who are investors or business people are concerned about this. Not everyone is willing to work on it full time like I am, but I think everyone is or should be concerned about it. And a few people are not. Primarily those people are people who make money from extracting minerals from the earth and selling them. Most people who make money, and most of our members, are involved in businesses or investments that need to sell things to people. Like I was talking about our members before, they do things like selling expensive ice cream or shoes or organic groceries or all kinds of other things to people who have to have enough money to pay for all of those things. So I think that everyone should be concerned about the growing inequality in our nation because it's not going to be sustainable. So our target audience is really, well, the real target is really the 500 and some odd people in Washington, D.C. who make these decisions and make laws that pass policy. But indirectly, they hopefully report to their voters. So we're trying to influence all the people who vote to tell their representatives to make some of these changes.
And Morris, so speaking of Washington, there's a lot going on in Washington these days, lots of big debates. Do you think that Republicans and Democrats are roughly the same, and so it doesn't really matter who you vote for?
Well, no, I don't actually. I think there's some pretty big differences between the two parties. I think we saw at the end of 2017, the Republicans were in charge. They passed a tax change, they passed a major change to our tax system with only Republicans voting for it, all the Democrats voting against it. And that major change resulted in far lower tax rates for wealthy people like me, and essentially no major changes for the vast majority of the people in this country. So it really exacerbated inequality a lot. And unfortunately, I think there are people who think that's a good thing. There are people who want to be richer and richer and richer, regardless of what difference that makes the rest of the country, and regardless of what difference it makes even for their own grandchildren, who are going to grow up and have to find, things to do and ways to make money too. So no, I don't think the two parties are all the same. I think that you're seeing Democrats talking about things like childcare for people. Democrats think that people are not able to work because they're not able to afford childcare for their kids and they have to stay home and take care of their kids. Republicans think that people don't work because they're too lazy and they'd rather collect welfare. I don't know anyone who would rather live on welfare than working. I've never even met that person. But I think the problem is that a lot of Republicans think to themselves, well, if I could get as much money for free from not working, I would do it. And they think that's how everyone is. But I don't think they actually know people who work for a living because they spend all of their time in their fundraising parties where people pay $1,000 or $5,000 or whatever to have a few minutes with their congressperson. And so they know very well the sort of challenges and I don't know, I guess you can call them challenges of being rich and frustrations of being rich. And there are a lot of rich people who are frustrated not being even richer. And they don't really spend that much time talking to all the people who are not rich, not even close to rich, and have frustrations about having to work for a living. and sometimes having to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs to make a living to support their families. So no, I think there's a huge difference between the 2 parties.
And Morris, right now, the Congress is debating this big spending bill, and they want to have the tax revenue to cover the expenditures that they want to make. Now, the difference between our group and President Biden's agenda is that we think that they could fund this by only taxing people like our members. Our members have the qualification for being a member is that you have at least $1 million of income and you have at least $5 million in assets. So we only want to tax people who make more than $1 million in income or have more than $5 million in assets. President Biden, in contrast, would like to start having people pay slightly higher taxes around the 400, 450 mark. And so he's laid out a set of investments and a set of revenues that he thinks should cover those investments. So Morris, it seems pretty straightforward to me that Jeff Bezos, who just bought himself, built himself a rocket ship, that he could pay some higher taxes and that he certainly shouldn't be paying a lower tax rate than me and other working people. But so how come Biden's agenda didn't just float through on February 1st after the inaugural? Why didn't all the Democrats just check the box and get that bill passed? What's holding them up?
Oh, it's very sad. And there are, unfortunately, a few Democrats, comparatively, who I don't think want to tax the rich, who I don't think want to make big changes. I went to the office of, a senior Democratic politician, and I asked, now that you're the chairman, what big, bold things are you going to do? And he said, none. And, it's just sad that we have leaders who are, I don't know if they're more afraid of breaking something. I think they are afraid of breaking something. I think they are afraid of breaking their long-term policy of sort of appeasing the rich. And they think somehow, if we don't appease the rich, they'll, I don't know what, go on strike or something. I think it's just ridiculous and sad. And it gets to the next question I see. It says, you mentioned the reason we are where we are because of rich politicians in power. But how can we get away from that and towards politicians who truly serve the people? Is that even possible, especially in a country where politicians with big donors are more likely to get elected?
Yeah, I could take a crack at this, Morris, or just add a couple comments. Y'all, we have seen a huge sea change in the 11 years since we started this organization. When we started this thing, one of the reasons it blew up in the media is that nobody was talking about the fact that rich people would also be better off if they paid higher taxes. It would be, as Morris says, like, who wants to be a rich man in a poor country? Be a rich man in a rich country. That's an infinitely better way to live. And so finally people are getting the message. And so you saw for the first time in decades, Joe Biden, presidential candidate, ran on raising taxes on wealthy people. And as we sit here today, basically most of the Democratic Party is in agreement. They have some disagreements about what the details are, but they're generally in agreement that the tax code is completely skewed to the wealthy, that we need to get rid of the preferential treatment that the rich get in the tax code, and we need to make some real serious reforms. We have 14 lawmakers whose votes we need and who are not on board with this change. You can go to taxtherich.com and see all 14 of them, but I'll give you an example of 2. Senator Joe Manchin has not signed up for this yet. He has said he wants to do some great tax reform. So that's why we're in West Virginia talking to him. Kirsten Sinema seems very adamantly opposed to taxing her wealthy donors. And so we're going to have to see what we can do about that. And then there are another 12 Democratic House members, including really led by Josh Gottheimer, who is a congressperson from New Jersey, who simply, it doesn't seem, does not want to raise taxes on his wealthy contributors. So we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years. And I think that we just need to keep on making that progress. And if there was one, if you've never called the Senate or the House before, today would be the day to do it. So the number to the switchboard of the Senate is 202-224-3121, 224-3121, area code 202. Your lawmakers need to hear from you right now. The Democrats have an historic opportunity to begin the process of untangling this ridiculous web of corruption that is embodied in our tax code. And we really need to make sure that they take advantage of this opportunity. Let's see. So, and Morris, here's another one. It seems that most states, so this is switching to minimum wage. It seems that most states are hesitant on establishing a higher minimum wage. In an ideal world, how long would you estimate that it would take for every state to establish their minimum wage at $15?
In an ideal world, it would be done immediately. I think there's no reason, I mean, I'm not an expert on everything, but I don't think people can reasonably expect it to live and support a family on the current minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. So I think that we should have a higher minimum wage. I think that people really have the wrong impression based on small numbers of people who, frankly, are just kind of greedy, I think. You know, what we try to explain to people is that for business owners, for people who are running businesses, you know, like, you know, say when you go out for a beer, the guy who owns that bar, he's a lot more concerned about how much beer money everyone in the bar has than are the wages of the one guy who's standing behind the bar pouring the beer. You know, when they raised the minimum wage in the Seattle area, you know, just a few years ago, in Seattle, you know, the restaurant owners complained, oh my God, we'll be driven out of business. We can't afford to pay more. This is ridiculous. The guy who was complaining the most actually had to lease more space because he's getting more people in his restaurants because so many people have gotten raises and can afford to eat out who couldn't afford to eat out before. So yes, I think that we should have higher minimum wages. I think that Republicans want to talk about, oh, free market, Chicago school. You know, we can't, you know, interfere with the free market. That's not right. You know, some of those same people, of course, complaining now that the government has to do something because wages are rising too much. And the government should come up with some kind of plan to reduce wages because they don't want them to go up so much. But we've never had, well, prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, we did have a free market in labor, and we did allow buying and selling of enslaved people. We don't do that anymore. Our country has recognized a long time ago that a free market in labor, buying and selling it, is not something that's it's just morally repugnant, is what it is. So we've gone beyond the free market argument. And I think it's completely correct and right for the government to step in and regulate the market in labor.
And we have a basic premise here, which is if you can't afford to pay an employee something they can live on, you can't afford an employee. And if your business model relies on exploiting human beings, then you shouldn't have a business. It's not more complicated than that. And so right now there's a federal bill to raise the wages all across the country to $15 an hour. And that again, no Republicans are on the bill, so they have no interest in raising the wages of working people, but most Democrats are on the bill. There are 7 Democrats and 1 independent who are not on that bill. And so we need to get that federal bill passed. But in the meantime, I mean, there is some good news in all of this. And I think maybe we should just wrap with a little bit of the good news. Several states have passed $15 an hour. And I'll tell you what's great. It's not along political lines. In the last election in Florida, Donald Trump won the state of Florida. And at the same time, a ballot initiative for raising the state wage to $15 an hour passed by over 60%. When Tom Cotton, who's a Republican from Arkansas, when he ran for re-election several years ago. At the same time that he won re-election, there was a ballot initiative raising Arkansas's minimum wage. I think it was to 12, if I remember specifically, and that passed overwhelmingly. So one of the things about the Patriotic Millionaires organization, so again, we work on three things: taxes, wages, and equal political representation. And all of the policies that we support are also supported by the bipartisan majority of Americans. The only people who disagree with our incredibly obvious solutions, tax the rich, pay people something they can live on, and spread the political power a little bit more, these are obvious, basic kind of human values and good public policy. They create stable, strong societies that are more cohesive, that people want to raise their families in. And so the people who disagree with those things, though, are largely politicians in Washington and a small set of donors who are trying to pay their way into a world where they are the only people with any power and any money. And so before we wrap, though, it can be, talking about tax policy can be frustrating, but we have made a lot of really good progress. Morris, a really big deal is going on in the international tax front that we think is going to be transformative. Can you tell people about that good news?
Yeah, I mean, we've had basically all the countries, the major countries in the world economies in the Western world, agree on a higher minimum corporate tax. And that will hopefully, if not end, cut down the idea of companies sort of pretending they earn income in one country that's really in another country. And, you know, booking their income in Ireland or Liechtenstein or the Cayman Islands or someplace when they sell stuff in the United States of America or the United Kingdom. And so I think that's certainly a step in the right direction. I'm not sure what we're going to see or when we're going to see it happen, but I think that we're going to see some improvements. I think we're going to see that affecting both countries like the United States, where a lot of companies make lots of money, and countries in the developing world, where they're also hurt by companies that, you know, extract minerals from their earth and whatnot and do things to generate profits, but still book their profits in tax havens somewhere else. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, the agreement that we've seen internationally.
Yeah, that's true. It's a great piece of good news. And then on the domestic, I'll say two pieces of good news, one on the tax front and one on the minimum wage front. On the tax front, you know, Morris sat down and worked with his peers to write this letter 11 years ago. And we were in the wilderness. And I will tell you, when we travel the country and talk to people, both working people and wealthy people, it's almost become like a stop smoking campaign. I mean, just the overwhelming majority of people recognize that we need to tax wealthy people, because not only are they going to accumulate all of this money to the detriment of everyone else, but with all of that money, they are accumulating enough power that they are a threat to our democracy. So we have a huge commitment compared to where we were a decade ago for just general people and the political establishment. As I said, Joe Biden ran on taxing wealthy. So that's a great piece of good news. We're making good progress. And the second piece is that a lot of states have raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour, and a whole bunch of states have eliminated the sub-minimum tipped wage and had people make one wage the same as everybody else. And then if you work in the service industry, you get tips on top of that. So we're making some good progress. It's not as fast as I would like. I'm sure it's not as fast as everybody on this call would like, but you know, progress can be slow, but we are moving in the right direction. And we want to keep that momentum going. So if you're interested in joining our fight to tax the rich and save America, you can go to taxtherich.com and sign up. We will tell you how to organize, what we're focusing on, which lawmakers you should be talking to. We'll give you great materials. If you don't feel like reading the whole Tax the Rich book, there's a 15-minute version of the book and a PowerPoint presentation on the website. We would love for y'all to visit that and sign up to join our fight. We're having a great time traveling around West Virginia. We're going to go back to Washington and keep on pounding on these lawmakers and try to convince them to do the right thing. And we would love for your help in doing it. And I guess with that, we'll close. I don't see that we have any more questions. Do we have any more questions before we wrap? So we do have one more question, and I think Morris is going to run to an interview in just 1 second. So we'll just do this last question quickly. is a $15 minimum wage for all states really a solution? There's such a difference in cost of living from state to state. And that's so true. There's a big cost of living difference from state to state. But like if you take the rural part of New York and the rural part of North Carolina, there's not a particular difference between those two. And New York has a $15, is coming to a $15 minimum wage. North Carolina is where I'm originally from, is at $7.25. So the difference really in cost of living is between cities and then smaller towns or more rural areas. But what we want to do is establish a federal wage floor. And so that's what the minimum wage is. And then we'd like to see municipalities and cities and things like that raise the wage above that if they think that's necessary for their residents. But we want to start off with a federal floor that is strong enough that it can support a strong middle class. So again, thank you so much. We loved being with y'all tonight. And read Tax the Rich, How Lies, Loopholes, and Lobbyists Make the Rich Even Richer, and go to the website if you want to join our fight.
Thank you to everyone who took time out of their busy schedules, especially during the week, to be able to attend the seminar. And a special thanks to both Erica and Morris for giving us this stimulating conversation. Make sure for those who are on this call to go to the Seminary Co-op and purchase their book, Tax the Rich. And also, in case you didn't see the link that was sent in the chat. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you all. Bye now.